So we will not have live class on Thursday. I'm going to be at an Excel training, so neither I nor Mom will be there. No, we are taking it. We are learning all about things that we may or may not already know. We'll find out. It'll be interesting, but we're going to schedule from like 8 to 5. It might be. We'll be there. I'll see how it goes. It sounds interesting. Sometimes these courses are very, very good. Sometimes they're not so good. So we'll see how it is. So this week, we're going to condense it down just a little bit then. So we're going to run through some book material, and then we're going to talk about the current events when in class. So if you're in class, I will give you something to put into if we have a discussion about said topic. And you just did it, didn't you, Kimberly? Kimberly's trying to get extra bonus points. There is a discussion board there. I'll show you. I had to move it up to the top. There's now 2 pages of them. They're so long, at the very bottom right-hand corner, you have to click to the second page of them. So I scrolled it all the way up to the top to make it easier now. One of the changes in Blackboard, it used to just scroll down in infinity. I can't even, but now it doesn't. So we want to look at what kind of things when we look at this risk. So we know we're going to have risk. What are our options to deal with risk? So what kind of things can we do with risk? Well, let me make sure it's got a volume on here because it's doing something weird in my ear. No, it's not Yesels to Wessels. That sounds horrible. All right. I've lost my volume control, so I'm hoping it's recording a volume on there. If not, we'll re-record. So what can we do when we have risk? Well, we can do a couple of things. We can accept that there's going to be risk. And we do that in our own life. How many of you ride a motorcycle? Drive. So you do a dirt bike. Is there more chance you're going to get injured in that dirt bike than if you walk? All right. So you've accepted that you're going to take some risk. And we do the same thing with some of these risks. We say, you know, there's a risk that this can happen, but we're willing to take that chance. And what is that acceptable level? We can mitigate it. In other words, we can cover that. So one of the things we do as a college is we purchase a cybersecurity insurance policy. So we know there's risk. We've looked at what it's going to cost. And we say, okay, now we're going to take out an insurance policy to help us with that in case something does happen. We can transfer that risk to somebody else. So the easiest way we transfer that, quite simply, is we assign it to somebody else. Well, how do we assign risk to somebody else? So in the terms of like a credit card company, can we outsource that to a third party to minimize our risk? Could we do those kinds of things? Yeah. So in a lot of cases, we minimize our own risk. So we hire somebody to paint the third story of our house because we don't want to climb up a ladder. We're transferring that risk to somebody else because we don't bounce very well when we fall down. So there's some strategies we're going to look at really quickly then to deal with this risk. And so a defense strategy then gives us that way to counter. We try to avoid risk. So we may have policy, we may have training, we may have technology. And those are generally our 3 biggest issues. So policy, in other words, we write things and we ensure that our employees behave according to those rules. We train and educate users about why we don't just give out passwords. And so I saw an interesting example of that. I'm on a web steering committee about our new website that they're working on right now. We went to a training the other day that started out with the phrase, never, ever, 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 ever email your username and password to anybody else. And they repeated that about 12 times in 30 minutes of training. Because quite frankly, that's an issue, and a lot of people do that. Now, in this class, would you guys think that I'm never going to email a username and password to somebody? Probably, I hope not. But the reality is, if I ask the average user in most companies to email me a username and password because I'm with the IT department, sure, click, and it's done. Now, for the most part, now there may be some uses where we do it for troubleshooting if it's a specific user, but for the most part, does the IT department or anybody need your username and password to gain access to your accounts? No. So anytime you get those, so if you get an email that says, hey, can you send me your username and password because your email account seems to be full. These phishing attacks are pretty common, and so it's one of those things we just have to deal with. And that's, again, that idea of training and education. And then we have technology. How do we apply technology? Things like firewalls, intrusion detection systems. Maybe we put in an antivirus that's also got an email scanner, so it boots out a lot of those things. We're not going to be 100% effective, but yet we might get 99% effective. And so between those three, we can get rid of a lot of issues, or hope we can. So transferal, in other words, we try to shift that risk to others. So a deployment model, in other words, we use somebody else to handle our credit card billing. We may purchase insurance so that they get the risk, not us. So just recently, Quicken Loans had a basketball challenge, and you guys all probably heard about it. And it got a lot of buzz about $1 billion payout. And so the insurance company, so Warren Buffett part really was the insurance player in that. And they insured Quicken Loans that if somebody actually got a perfect bracket, even with the tremendous odds against it, that they would pay out $1 billion over whatever the conditions were. So would Quicken Loans be able to do that? Probably not, but they outsourced to somebody else who figured the odds, bought insurance. So we may have service contract providers, those kinds of things. And sometimes we rethink, how do we even offer services? So maybe a risk here at Peru State College is the risk of something like a SARS or a bird flu. Well, we have strategies in place. So part of our response then is almost all of our classes are now on Blackboard. So could we close the physical campus for 2 weeks and continue to operate and hopefully get everybody well? And a lot of high schools have went to the same model because they've had such an outbreak of illness that they've had to do those kinds of things. So how do we transfer that risk? There's some things that don't work. So if we pick on poor Sydney, it's hard for us to play basketball virtually, isn't it? But how do we transfer some of those risks in basketball? Well, we can do some similar strategies. So we can substitute people in. So some way to transfer that risk. So mitigation means reduce the damage. In other words, we know that something could happen. How do we mitigate the amount of damage? So one of the things we know at Peru State College is the local power provider is not very reliable. Can we say that? At least twice a year we lose power for an extended time. So we know we're going to lose power. It's something that we've written down. We know, yes, that's going to happen. So we can have a couple of different response plans. So we can have an incident response plan. So how do we think about that in terms of an incident, a disaster recovery, and a business continuity plan? So we know that these kinds of things are going to happen. How do we recover from them? So an incident response plan might be those things like a text messaging service. Now I find this interesting that our response is a text messaging service, but that is the way most students get their information, isn't it? So the cell phone tower has a backup generator and in theory is able to operate, and you'll get a text message saying, oh, by the way, the power is out on campus. Okay. And if it's over a certain amount of time, then they'll say go down to the AWAC because they have a generator for that. So it's a way to plan that. Disaster recovery then is that idea of we know this disaster's happened, we've lost power. Do things get damaged when we lose power? So in the network equipment, sometimes equipment will get damaged. Having a plan plan for how to bring that up, or the copiers that go out, those kinds of things. Business continuity, how do we keep the college operating? So that generator is one that actually feeds the servers, so it'll actually hopefully keep up most of our web servers. We know that Blackboard is available, so how do we do that business continuity? Some way to maintain our business. So if we're a for-profit business, how do we keep the phone lines up and people calling in, offering us orders if we're Cabela's? So those kinds of tasks. So we need these plans in place. And so here's a matrix of a fairly quick, easy way. So an incident response. So what do we do during a disaster? And so some of those things in that disaster, things like intelligence gathering. What is going on? Why is it going on? How long is the power going to be down? Because that feeds what kind of our response is going to be. So if it's in the middle of the winter, we have no heat on campus because the power's out, is that a different response than if it's a week after graduation and students are already gone from campus? Sure, it is a different response. So business continuity then, if we look down at the bottom, so it lists what steps can we keep a business opening. An example of that is a hot site with a remote location. And then we look at the time frame. So sometimes business continuity, if we had a tornado come through and take out the administration building, that business continuity plan would be for months and months. How do we get things back up and running versus a power outage of a couple of hours? And so sometimes that intelligence gathering, finding out what's wrong, how do we deal with it? So that's kind of our three basic strategies then if we're going to try to mitigate whatever's happened. And we usually use combinations of these. And then there's this idea that we're going to have acceptable risk. So we're going to do nothing. And that seems to be a little bit callous, doesn't it, that we're going to do nothing? And we have to very carefully weigh then what are the costs versus what are the potential benefits of weighing that decision. So if I decide I'm going to do nothing, do I save up front because I don't have training, I don't have technology costs? Sure. But maybe it's such a low risk that we think we can deal without it. And so we look at that, the probability of it, and what the potential damage is, and could we even mitigate it? And so in some cases we look at that because there are things we can't stop. We can tell a tornado's coming, but can we do anything really to stop a tornado once it's arrived on campus? We don't have the force field dome yet. So we'll have to figure out some way to deal with that once it happens. So this idea of acceptance, then we have to look at some way to identify what the costs are and how we benefit from not or protecting an asset. And so sometimes we have to have something called a cost-benefit analysis. So in other words, we need to balance the costs versus the benefits and see where we lie and which method will work best for us. So there's always the option of termination. So we remove it from whatever risk environment. So if the risk is we think we're going to get worms or viruses from the internet, can I just take that asset and completely firewall gap it so it's not connected to the internet? Well, there are assets we can do that with. Can I take the Blackboard server and firewall gap it? No, I can't remove it from that risk. So sometimes there are assets we can physically remove, or we can do some other structures where we actually eliminate the risk completely. And I like the term elimination better than termination. Termination always seems like somebody's going to hand you a pink slip. So, Arnold Schwarzenegger's going to show up, and we're going to have, but those are great movies, except the last one that they tried to make, which was not. Yeah, 1 and 2, great movies. All right, so managing risk. So we have to have that trade-off, and some organizations are very very, very risk avoidance. In other words, they are not willing to take on much risk at all. And other organizations are very conservative, and they're willing to take on more risk. And so we need to find out corporate-wide or company-wide or nonprofit or organization, whatever we are, what our risk tolerance strategy is. How do we determine those kinds of things? So, and we have another term here called residual risk. And so residual risk is no matter what we do, there's always going to be some risk left in our organization. We cannot eliminate it all. So we're not trying to ever remove it completely. That would be A, impossible, and B, so costly, both in terms of manpower, equipment, time, etc. But we need to bring whatever's left, in other words, that risk piece that we can't control, down to whatever is acceptable in terms of dollars, in terms of liability to our own company. So there's a couple of really interesting rules. So when it exists in an important asset, so what can we do to keep that important asset? We've determined we can't get rid of that asset, or we can't completely air gap it, or we can't get rid of the risk attack that way. So we're looking at weighing the cost versus that benefit. So can we implement additional policies? Can we implement additional technical support? And so at some point we need to come up with a way to determine those costs. So, So here's a really quick flow chart, if you want to think about it that way, where I can look through and I can see, can I accept that risk? Can I not? And so you can apply whatever risk factors you want to put in here into something like, so a threat source could be outside cyber attackers. So is it vulnerable? So is our web server vulnerable to that? If yes, okay, then we need to move on. Is it exploitable? So our website, we could configure, maybe it's vulnerable but not exploitable. In other words, they could change the logo on the blackboard, wouldn't affect us in terms of monetarily, and we could move on. So this is just a flow chart we can work our way through. And then we have one-set control strategy. So in other words, the previous one kind of let us find the appropriate control strategy that we could use. Now, how do we manage that existing risk? Because there's still going to be some risk existing. And so this, if you notice, is kind of a circular model. So we identify it, we plan for it. Is it acceptable risk? If it's not acceptable risk, then we modify our existing plan. And again, since these risks change on nearly a continual basis, we need to be up and able to change those. So we have something called a cost avoidance. And so again, we're looking at that cost-benefit analysis. So if we have a defense strategy versus the ability to add some kind of a control, so we eliminate the upfront cost, and so we need to decide if the back-end cost, in other words, what's going to happen if we do that strategy, is it within those acceptable limits that we're willing to tolerate? Does it generate, if we want to think of it, a positive economic gain for us? Because we're going to spend the money either on the front end or the back end. How do we do that? So we have to value these assets and determine their loss value. So in other words, what is that asset worth to me as an organization? So if I think about Blackboard, well, it's a server and it's got software on it, and I can tell you the value of the server. So maybe the server is $100,000. The software would be $50,000 a lease for a year. But is that its true economic value to us as an organization? No. What else is on that server? So what if Blackboard crashed week 14 of a 16-week classes, what would you do? What would you do? We said, well, you know, since it's all gone, we have to make you guys repeat all this to obtain accreditation. Well, that's one possible answer, but not possibly the best answer. So this idea of economic value is not just that cost of the hardware or the software. It's also some other things, and we'll talk about a few other things that happen with that. So we do something called a CBA, or cost-benefit analysis. So we look at the costs, we look at the benefits, and we look at, is this going to be then truly the best strategy for us? So cost. Any of our assets may have hardware, they'll have software. Well, those are pretty easy to do. But what if that software is custom developed? What about services? What about fees to reinstall it? What about training costs? And we think, well, we're already trained in this software. Why would we need retrained? Well, think about this example that maybe we'd been using Blackboard version 9. Well, in the meantime, during this disaster, Blackboard version 17 comes out, and you're not allowed to go back and reinstall that older version. And that actually happens, especially on these custom designed software packages. You can't implement new things. So what about that cost to implement? So hardware, software, vendors, who all has to be involved? What about the cost of having people stand around while you're doing that? So if I had 500 employees and they're not able to do anything while I'm re-implementing our software package, that's a pretty good chunk. Well, you can say go home, but what if they're on a yearly contract? And if I tell you to go home and you're not working for 2 weeks, what's the likelihood you're going to be applying for another job? And it's not the worst employees that can't get a job anywhere else that are going to run away. It's your best employees that are going to disappear. So we have to think about that. What about cost for maintenance? So now we discovered our phone system has a vulnerability. Now, rather than no expense for yearly maintenance, we decide we're going to add another $12,000 in. So all those ideas are costs that we have in this. Well, and then we have this idea of benefits. So we need to determine what our costs are, then we can look at some of the benefits. So we have formulas, and I know you guys are going, oh, great. So they're pretty easy. Compared to business finance, these formulas are pretty easy, although you'll see them. So one of the things we look at is something called an annualized loss expectancy. Oh, that sounds horrible, but really it means the cost of our loss times how many times we think it's going to happen in a year. So what if it's 0? Maybe. Think about your car. Anybody ever lock their keys in their car? Yeah. How much did it cost you to get them unlocked? So if I had to call a locksmith around here, and I happen to know that from a couple of years ago, it was $65 for me to get my keys unlocked out of my own vehicle. The local officer couldn't get the Slim Jim in my car. So $65. So if that happens once, my annualized loss expectancy is $65. Well, if I'm a real meringue and I lock my keys in my car 3 or 4 times a year, then that's going to go up. So if it's 4 times a year, that's $260 in annualized loss. So it happens. People lose their keys. It does happen. These things happen. And the little magnetic ones you put underneath your car thinking they're going to be there, they don't stick very well. Oh, so baling wire is the answer to life. Well, it is. We're looking at that benefit. So what is it going to cost us? So if we know that Blackboard goes down 12 times a year, what is its cost going to be? And so we can look at what it would cost for an hour's worth of downtime. So we have to assign a value to our assets. So people are assets, software are assets, and some of them are pretty easy to fix, and we know what they cost. So a switch they use as an example, a desktop computer, it's $1,000 for a desktop computer. Depending on the switch, it may be $1,000 to $10,000, who knows what. But we can determine that value pretty easily. What's more interesting to try to figure out, what about the value of Target market, or Target, if we use Target as a company, what about the value of its stock because of the loss they took from being exploited over Christmas and some of the decisions they made to continue to be exploited? Well, that's kind of hard to determine. What would their stock price be if they hadn't been exploited? What about that loss of face value? Do you want to go use your credit card in Target after seeing that not only did they get exploited, but they continued to allow it to go on and didn't respond to it? So no, and how do we determine those losses? And so some of those, what if a couple of years ago we did get exploited far worse than what happened? So not only did the student gain access, but they'd actually gotten all those student records, and they went out and got credit cards in every student's name at Peru State, Wayne State, Chadron State, UNMC, UNL. Would that loss have been very substantial in terms of face value? Because how are colleges and universities generally ranked? Well, students want to go there for a variety of reasons, but it's usually that name value. And so that name value plays a part in what the value is. So Coca-Cola has a name that is worth a lot of money. Google has a name. So if those are besmirched, it becomes very hard to recover from that. And in fact, some companies have actually changed names after security and other incidents to try to get that issue out of them. So when I think of Exxon, immediately my brain goes to the Exxon Valdez and what happened with that. Because that was an event that happened and I think about. So sometimes that cost is not just a pure monetarily one, and it's not very easy to retain. So some things we might want to look at. We might want to look at what's the value if we had to replace it? What is it going to cost to replace this? What's that value to the owners? So how we determine this value, sometimes we got to bring the accountants in and try to figure out some of these values. And some of those are economic values, not simply dollar values. So we have to think about those in terms of what is it going to cost to replace that information, that value. So if our student information system went down and they had to do a backup from 2 weeks ago, how many students have just now registered? Okay, do you want to get up and do the Cappy? I'm going to graduate dance cam. Okay. We don't have that on video, or we could. So if I'll turn on the webcam and try to add it to the class, we can do the happy I'm going to graduate dance. But how do we reenact that value? What is it going to gain us? So 2 weeks of work, how much is that going to cost us? And there's been losses of data here on our college, here on almost any business. You've lost data at some point. What does it cost to recreate that and go back and try to reestablish that? And then think about that student who didn't get re-enrolled because we didn't notice their record. So Sydney, all of a sudden you get this letter going, hey, apparently you didn't want your basketball scholarship because you didn't enroll for classes. And you go, what? No, I really did. Well, don't look at me that way. Wow. So she gave me the scary, like, don't you be talking about that, because it hopefully won't happen. But how do we recreate that data, and what's it going to cost us? And so that, again, is that value of that asset. So whatever it costs us to build that student information system, it's fairly negligible compared to the value of that data that's inside of it. So we may have intellectual property. So Google, for example, they have a lot of intellectual property. They also are very valuable to adversaries. So would Yahoo like to get access to all of the intellectual property, or watch Google's fall on their sword for whatever reason? They got caught, snooping through Wi-Fi passwords again or something? Yeah. Loss of productivity. So not only do we have to recreate data, we have to deal with these employees that aren't working. What about that loss of productivity? What about that loss of revenue? So if we're a fairly large company, so State Farm couldn't take any new clients for 2 months, think about that loss of revenue that would happen. And in extreme cases, think about assets we can't even categorize what their value is. It's very hard to. What about disaster recovery in the event of a local hospital being damaged by a tornado? How does that affect people who are injured? So Now there's no longer a hospital in Auburn, and people have to go 50 miles away when they have a heart attack. Is that going to be a... Now, granted, if they have a heart attack, they're stopping at Auburn and then getting shipped somewhere else. But that first step in that preventive care might be very, very critical. And how do we categorize those dollar values? So, this sounds far worse than it is. So, single loss expectancy. So, in other words, what the value is from the most likely loss from one attack. So we could figure out if Blackboard got exploited, we could go through all kinds of calculations to figure out the value of the asset and what percentage it would, if we had a particular attack, what its loss would be. So if we valued it on Blackboard at $1 million, and we figured an attack was going to be $50,000, that gives us that value. So we have something called a percentage loss, so exposure factor. So if Blackboard got exposed, so we say $1 million for our asset value, and our exposure factor is 5%, what would that be in terms of a cost, or that single loss expectancy? So if that happened, and these are just numbers thrown out of my head, that would give us that exposure factor. It would give us an SLE of $50,000. Well, then we can also take that rate of occurrence. In other words, how often we expect that attack to happen. So if we think it's going to happen once every year, then it would be times 1. If we think it's times maybe once every 2 years, then it would be a 50% or 0.5. So we can plug that into our formula. So we take that SLE times that expected, in other words, what percentage of times we think is going to happen, to get an annualized. In other words, we're trying to get an expected annual cost due to these risks. So we don't do this just with cyber attacks. Let's take our basketball team or other sports team. Do we know that at some point some athlete's going to get injured and it's going to cost the school money on their insurance policy? We assume it's never going to happen. We don't know when it's going to happen, but we can look at historical data, and so we could say that once every 2 years, we'll pick on the football players, once every 2 years a football player gets a leg broken. I said a leg broken. So, say we had 13 operations. Well, we could figure that. Okay, so we can take historical data to annualize that. Usually 4. All right. So if our annual rate of occurrence is 4, and the average cost then is $10,000, we know what our annual loss expectancy is then for the football program. We can do the same thing with the basketball program, and hopefully they're not breaking as many legs, although there's a lot of ankle injuries and knee injuries as you're in rehab right now. So no sport is without risk. Cross country, do we have any? Softball, even the golf players can get injured. You can throw your back out, you can get golfer's elbow. So, but what the point is that we can figure out what our annualized loss expectancy is. So this CBA then gives us a way, we know what our annualized loss might be. We know what we might need to spend then. And so we can juggle those and say, which way do we want to spend? So what if we came up with a way to build a football field that nobody would get a torn ACL? So we already said our expected loss is $40,000 a year. Somehow we came up with that. Well, we could come up with a football field that it would cost us $5 million that nobody would ever get a torn ACL on. Does that make sense to do that? So, now, that sounds fairly cavalier, But the reality is when you pick a turf for that football field, you look at those kinds of things. Because some of the turfs are less prone to injury. So what we look then is we have a formula. So we can look at the pre-control, after the control, and we look at that, what's the annual cost to safeguard us against that? And so sometimes we make those decisions about how much do we spend to protect our assets, whether those assets are people, places, things, and we look at those costs. So right now, General Motors. Has anybody been following the General Motors and the switch issue? Oh. So General Motors has a switch issue that, depending on which source you read, would have cost them, I've seen anywhere from 50 cents to a couple of dollars to rectify the situation where the car doesn't catch on fire. And if we look, that's been historical. And so my guess is somebody at some point said, well, I know, but we sold 100,000 of those cars. That would have been $250,000. We don't think we're going to get sued more than $5,000. And they made those kinds of balancing acts. So there's other ways we can establish this feasibility. So there's other tools that we can use. So we might look at operational feasibility. So sometimes we also call this the idea of behavioral feasibility. So how many places have you worked at where we've told you to do something and nobody did it? Yeah. So let's think about football players. All the time. Does your coach ever tell you every day, go out and stretch, do this? No, we're not going to really do that. So in other words, how do we get people to behave according to the way we'd like to? So maybe we came out with some new super stretch that would prevent ACL tears. If we can't get the users to accept it, it's going to fail. So that resistance to change, people, and the worst line you'll ever hear when you go out there and you're a manager, and I'm assuming all of you will be managers, is, well, we've always done it this way. And immediately when somebody says that, that means I'm not willing to change. Change is hard. Change is painful. They can. There is a great book, Who Moved My Cheese. It's great. It is. I'll give you it's really cheesy book. But what we're looking at is, how do we get people to change? And so continual training, how do we get people to learn? So one of the issues that a lot of places have is passwords and logouts. How do we get people to log out of their computer? So even here in this classroom, how many times have you come in and you sat down and you've sat down at a computer that somebody's still logged into their email, Facebook? It is almost every single day. Well, think about that at work. I'm at a hospital and I can't get the nursing staff or the med staff to log out of the computer sitting in a patient's room, and so the next thing you know, they're screwing around with the med system. So sometimes there's technology upgrades, and then you'll hear the, well, I don't want to have to relog in every 2 minutes or whatever we set it at. So education, how do we get people, so you have to show them, tell them, and work with them to say, you know, this is why we have to do this. And in some cases, you may have to do horrible things to people, including people who can't be willing to change. Sometimes it's better for your organization for those people not to be there. And that's a sad fact of reality, but that ability to change and evolve. So one of the weird things that I think is kind of interesting, so the girl I am dating is a clinical manager at a place where they deal with children and trying to make change with children. So all the therapists are change agents. They work with children trying to get them to change, the family structure to change. They're implementing a new med system. And the thing they hear back from all these people who change others and try to get other people to change is, well, that's not the way we've always done it. Wait, these are people supposed to be changing, and yet they're not. And it's fairly common. People don't want to change. They get an established habit, and they don't want to change. So that idea of training, education, and sometimes we have to do a combination of the carrot and the stick. Yes, we'll reward you for this behavior, but the reality is if you don't do this, here are some repercussions. And so we may look at log out times. We may put other implementations in. If somebody repeatedly keeps downloading a file off the internet and trying to install it on their computer, maybe we're going to have to talk to them about their issue. Why do you keep installing Facebook apps on our computer when we told you not to? Why do you keep opening up this email? Why, and there are people who every day is a new training day. So you never stop learning. However, hopefully it's not learning the same thing over and over and over again. So we also have the idea of technical feasibility. Is it possible to completely protect our system? What happens? What is the latest technology? And we're always a step behind those who want to exploit us. And we're always a step behind. We're trying to respond, so we're reactive in most cases to those threats. So new technology is always coming out. Is it even technically possible to stop and fix and change things? So I think in the next couple of years, you're going to see credit cards change significantly. I think you're going to go to see cards with chips in them. It's technically possible. It's already done in Europe and Asia and most countries. We've been reluctant in a lot of cases just because of cost and reluctance to change. So I think you're going to see credit cards change and evolve. And so watch for that. In Europe and in Asia, a lot of places you can use your smartphone to pay for things because it's got some of those technologies in it, and we don't yet have that available. And so I think those things are going to change. So technical feasibility changes. We also need to look at that cost of that. Can we do it internally? And so sometimes we need to hire outside experts to come in and do changes for us because we can't do them internally. And there's a great value to that. If we don't have somebody on board who's a routing specialist and a firewall specialist, sometimes we can do that and it'll be cost effective. Oftentimes we have political feasibility. So the one we always think about is how are you going to stop the CEO or the CFO or the director level people from doing what they want? Mutiny. So one of the interesting ones that's happened is IT staff have been very reluctant with the idea of bring your own device. And yet here come your CEOs with their iPads or their tablets or their Chromebooks or whatever's the newest fad or their phones and saying, here we are, you're going to make it work. And so we have that political realm. And so we can't always tell people no when the reality is that would be the safest course of action. So sometimes we have to work around that. Even when we're in the reactive mode of how do we fix a situation, the reality is 10 employees not being able to do their work may be less important than getting the CFO's email back up and running. And so sometimes we have those political ramifications that come into play. So politics are really one of those interesting and yet horrible and very easy to step on the wrong side and suddenly you find yourself. So there's other alternatives that we have. So there is the idea of benchmarking. So we look at other companies. We look at best practices. There are organizations that will come in and rate and do a lot of this work for us. So we've talked about NIST and some of these other organizations. So there are a list of NIST and other government agencies. We can look at our own baseline and compare what we're doing so we can come up with our own measures of performance. So there's a ton of different calculations. And so sometimes we want a little more forward. So ALE is very good. It's very labor and time intensive to get all these pieces and parts put together. And so some organizations, so a lot of times smaller ones, we may consolidate some of these things a little bit. So we may use some kind of a hybrid assessment scale. So rather than use a very specific dollar amount, we may use a sliding scale of 0 to 10. We have things we know are going to happen in the future, and we're going to look at how we deal with them. So we may make our own measure or use some kind of a hybrid measure. There's a technique that you've probably ran into in a salesman's class or other course called the Delphi technique, where we rank information and threats by industry leaders and our own internal people. So the Delphi technique is kind of a survey method, if you want to think about it that way. And so we come up to a conclusion that email hackers are our biggest threat, and we come up with that as a conclusion. And so we base our priority lists on those. There's the octave method, and then there's the octave S for smaller size corporations, companies. These, again, are another method that we can utilize. Microsoft, of course, has their own, because Microsoft likes to jump on board on all kinds of things. So again, though, they're really the same thing. We assess risk, we conduct a decision support analysis, we implement controls, and then we measure. So all of these techniques really have that idea that they're circular. We conduct some form of measurement, how effective are they, and then reassess. So there's also a fair analysis. So there is also, so you probably have heard of ISO 9000 and ISO 14000. Well, there's an ISO 27000 standards that also deal with risk management. And again, though, it should look familiar. Assessment, we treat it, what's acceptable, how do we communicate it, and how do we monitor and review it. But this is a fairly interesting methodology. So some companies are ISO standard companies. One of the benefits to ISO standards is it crosses international borders very well. So again, it's another standard methodology. NIST has another methodology for risk. And the NIST model looks very similar again. So we have the idea that we need to assess, respond, and monitor. Again, that circular motion. So there's all different kinds. There's nearly, when I started looking up lists of them, there's probably at least 100 different models of risk analysis. So depending on the size of the company you go to work for, unless you own your own company, they may already have some of these models in place. And so you need to modify. So if they're on an ISO organization, you may need to work within the framework that you're already given. If you're in a smaller organization, maybe you need to introduce the idea of risk management. And as a practice, develop some models very similar, but maybe on smaller scale, to assess why do we need enterprise-grade access points versus going down to Best Buy and buying a $50 Linksys router. And you could do that with that idea of what is our vulnerability, what is our cost, versus what is the cost of implementing this control. And so you could show that what is the most effective method to proceed. So even though we talk about these in terms of overall performance of a giant company, we can also bring them down to scale for a smaller size organization and maybe one particular item. So we did a vulnerability or threat assessment, and we realized, you know, we have open wireless access for everybody. It's on our domain network. And if they can manage to get on our wireless, they can go surfing and get to our shared files and folders. Well, that's not a very safe thing, so we could look at what is the cost of this, what is the cost to our reputation. So what is the value to that reputation at a small town bank if they lost all of the clients' money in a small town bank? And it would be pretty high. So we value that, and we look at that in terms of how do we create our generalized list. So this chapter we look at methodologies.